And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Dudes of Yore, episode 7. Going to be talking about campaigns today. I, of course, am one of the dudes here, Jeff Doty, joined as always by the wonderful other one here, Jeremy Lilley. How you doing, man?
Good, man. Doing all right. It's been a trying week, but I'm very much looking forward to our discussion tonight, and I can't wait to talk about that and maybe a little bit more about the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, having a short little chat beforehand about Marvel stuff. But yeah, we have a awesome special guest here with us today. The wonderful, as always, Matt Click. How you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty good. Like Jeremy, I've had a bit of a trial of a week, but this is definitely going to be a high point for me. I'm really excited to chat with you guys. So thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's always fun to talk shop. So, not that long ago, I actually had the pleasure of having you on my channel and discussing storytelling in RPGs. That was a really, really fun time.
Yeah, that was an awesome discussion. I actually was re-listening to that the other day just because I had forgotten about all the stuff that we had talked about. It was a really good chat.
Yeah, and we did our last episode of the Dudes of Yore with Lloyd Collins, and he came on and we kind of just answered a bunch of questions that people in the Facebook group had put together. And we did it live, and that actually worked really, really well, I thought. So I think that's kind of what we're doing tonight.
I was very happy with how it seemed to go on our end, and everybody who watched it was like, "Yep, this was really cool." When we did a poll in the ad tab group of whether we should record it or do it live, everyone was like, "Live, live, 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 live." I'm not sure that anybody said anything other than live. In fact, so this might be the way that we start doing it if people are into it. Yeah, but anyways, I'm super excited for this episode because we're going to be talking some campaign shop, how to build them, prepping, running, kind of our best tips and tricks for the long running game world. And I happen to be joined by like, if I made like a non-ordered list of top 5 best campaign running GMs, like both of you guys would be on it. So I think we're gonna have some good stuff to go around here.
Oh, you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That's very kind.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Your check's in the mail.
Yeah.
But let's handle business off camera, okay?
You can go ahead and level up your Harbinger character.
Yes. That's the exchange for sweetness.
Let's keep the curtain closed on the business end for now of that whole discussion. But we'll talk afterwards. Let's be clear. Yeah, I think kind of an interesting way to start things off would be kind of the starting point of a game. So like you have this idea, you know you want to run a campaign, you've decided that you have the time to run a campaign that you're ready to commit to. You come up with a concept and you pitch it. Like what's your guys' kind of like very first, like you have an idea and you're ready to make it a thing. Like what's the kind of starting process for you guys?
Well, for me, a lot of times I understand whether it's going to be a campaign or just a one-shot pretty early on, usually. I might get an idea from watching a movie or television series or whatever, and my mind will start to kind of just work on it, just while I'm in the car, while I'm in the shower. It just kind of tumbles it around like rocks in a tumbler. And depending on how much stuff kind of starts to gravitate and like attach itself to the nucleus, it kind of informs me very, very quickly of whether it's a one and done, cinematic action piece, or it's something that needs to be drawn out and have a lot of facets to it with a lot of emotion and things. So depending on which path my brain starts to take it, kind of determines what I start doing next. If it's a short one shot, then it's pretty simple. It's go find art, start putting together kind of the order of things, the 3 or 4 encounters that I want to be a part of it, and then that's pretty much it. With a a longer campaign, that's a much longer answer, and I think it'll probably be better to get into that more as we talk, because there's a lot of steps to it that I kind of go through.
Yeah, I think for me, it most often starts with like some sort of mental image or a very like simple idea of the kind of like main conflict I want to be involved in the campaign. Or like I think about villains a lot, and oftentimes the first thing that will like sort of coalesce for me is like some sort of villain or antagonist figure. Just because I like thinking about like what they look like and what their motives are and stuff like that. And then I'll kind of start thinking about like the main crux of the campaign, like what it kind of hinges on. And then from there, I stop thinking about the campaign as like a big picture thing, because I'm very much a session by session sort of GM. And I don't give a whole lot of thought to the overall story when I'm planning each session, but I do think that I tend to have a good feel for when to wrap things up and how to connect certain things. And it creates this grand illusion that I know what I'm doing when I really, really don't.
Yeah, there's definitely a certain I think once you start to run a couple more things like yourself, you start to see kind of how other people's minds work as far as campaigns and stuff go, and like how much of it is just like putting the board you're about to step on and nailing it onto the bridge as you're stepping. Um, at least that is almost always like entirely my process, even probably too much. I think that's definitely a place for improvement that I have, is to kind of set more groundwork up front, especially when it does come to like campaigns, because so much, at least for my kind of GMing style, comes into like who the characters are and what they want, which can be very difficult to like prep for ahead of time, because you don't really get an idea until you've like picked your players and they've pitched concepts. And even then, you don't really have a really good idea until you actually play a session and see the actual people in the game. Because sometimes the characters that you pitch will not play out the exact same way in game as you kind of expect them to uh, from the pitch, which is totally fine and even is a good thing, I'd say. But it can certainly kind of make the beginning stages more complicated, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree. And to piggyback on your analogy, like for me, when I start to prep a longer campaign, I kind of prep the trusses of the bridge, you know, and then I let the players kind of help me build the bridge as we're going. So from the very beginning, I have a general idea of kind of where I want it. Oh, I really want them to fight a Dracolic in the middle of a city. That's what I know I want to happen. And then I'll figure out the where, the why, and the how kind of along the way, and hopefully make it meaningful.
Yeah, and I think that like allowing yourself that room and that knowledge of like, this isn't going to play out the way I think it's going to play out, so I'm going to intentionally leave a lot of room, I think is really smart. And I think that when people really start enjoying game mastering is when they get to that point where they realize how easy campaigns can come together if you just like listen to the characters and what they want, because they basically tell you where they want the story to go and how they want it to end and what sorts of things they want to have happen. And it's like I had a writing teacher tell me one time, like, if you're having trouble writing, listen to your characters and they'll tell you what they want to say. And it's like, it's kind of the same with RPGs. Like if you just listen to the characters, and that includes the NPCs that you're creating, if you just listen to what they're saying, most of the time the campaign kind of writes itself. Like it goes into, I call it autopilot, where it just like, you're basically just sitting there like very loosely holding the wheel as you're careening down the highway.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for there's no new story to be told. And enough of us have consumed enough of these iterations of the same stories over and over again that as a plot starts to come out and unfold, most people can hop on board and say, okay, I see where this is going. And you can start making common logical conclusions of how things feel like they need to proceed. And it's a very age-old way of telling a story, of just kind of feeling where it needs to go based on the fact that you've heard the story just in different different coats of paint.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a degree to which people like underrate the power of like known quantities. Like if you have characters with like strong but like tropey goals, things like having a family that they want to protect, or like wanting to go, discover who they are, like these things that like literally every single story, especially in fantasy, is kind of about. And I think there's a tendency for people to kind of trick themselves into like, well, I'm going to do something like radically outside of that. But then everybody makes these characters who are like who they're attached to, and they kind of want to portray their own motivations, because like a lot of RPG characters, even characters who aren't human, have like inherently human motivations because we're people. So kind of letting that build a foundation of like these people are actual humans, or even if they're not human per se, and they'll kind of be able to follow their heart, as cheesy as it is to say something like that. And that's going to build more strong like story beats than like some like intricate specific plot will, at least especially in the sorts of groups that we tend to run with, where it is kind of more of a character narrative thing than like a board game. So just kind of don't be afraid to fall back on traditions, because they've been here for like 3,000 years for a reason.
I'm a huge advocate of tropes and cliches. Like again, they create a fantastic form of shorthand that is almost universal. So instead of me having to describe every single detail of a magical forest that's different from a forest on Earth, I can just say, you guys have seen the Avatar movie? Okay. That's what it looks like. It might be stealing or plagiarism or, like you said, tropey, but it works.
Okay, all great, all like this is something that I actually believe in fantasy. Like all great original ideas were basically just like stolen and then workshopped. Like there's really nothing that's like completely brand new. Like even like the beauty of it is seeing the twists that the individual person kind of puts on it that only they could make in their own kind of unique way, with the things that they've kind of collected together. Like I think like inspiration, at least for me, is much more like a collection of influence than trying to like come up with any specific thing. Like I'm the only person with my specific inspirations, even if none of them are new, the blend of them is different in a different way. It's like, don't be afraid to shy away from your influences. So if you see, campaigns that you've seen other people run that are like, oh man, that's so cool, like take it. Like obviously don't outright steal it, but like let it influence you and like use those things.
Yeah, you got to own it. Let your freak flag fly high.
So I think that there's kind of a lot of that is kind of like working with the flow, which I do think is great advice. But I am curious for you guys, like, so you've pitched a campaign concept, you've chosen players, they've kind of given you character stuff. Obviously, you can't necessarily go with the flow like pre-session one, because you don't really have anything to work off of. So like, what are the elements that you guys do like to have like in place to like start a game off? Kind of session zero going into session one, like these are the things that I want to be concrete, kind of give a starting point. Like, how do you guys usually like to kind of work in to do that session one, which can always be kind of awkward to kick things off?
Yeah, I feel like session ones are really tough, and I struggle with session ones quite a bit because, like you're saying, like there's no way to go with the flow in session one. You don't know what the characters are going to be like. You don't know what their motivations are going to be, and even if you do have a session zero, like you're saying, things are inevitably going to change as soon as everyone gets to the table and starts talking in character and rolling dice and everything. So like for me, it's really important for me to get a baseline of like what each character is sort of into. And so I like to, if I have an idea of the characters, at least like a basic sort of simple idea of what they're good at, their backgrounds, things like that, like I maybe try to work in things for each character so that I can have a moment with each character to sort of feel them out a little bit. And like in the L5R trilogy I ran, like in the first session, I had like stuff with spirits in there that I knew that Taylor's character could have stuff to latch onto and like have role play moments. I had a crab samurai in there, and I knew Jeremy's character would have a lot to talk about with that character. And so it's just like I intentionally worked in these things to make sure that each character had something cool to do. And I think for the players, that's really helpful too, because it gives them investment in the world right away. And so it's helpful on both sides of the screen, I feel. So that's like my main priority going into a session one is like, don't worry too much about setting things up for the big, you know, overarching plot, but like plant some little seeds, put some pieces on the board, and make sure that each character gets a little moment of some kind with an NPC, an item, an event from their past, something that they're good at and excel at.
It's like a pilot episode for a television series. You don't know exactly where it's going to go, and things are likely to change between the first and the second session. But we've got to start somewhere, and as messy as it might be, this is how we're going to start now. Yeah, I agree. And it's a very, very important thing that you brought up, I think, about making sure that there are things for everyone to do. Knowing your player characters and giving them something to interact with. Giving them that excuse to get hooked and reeled in. Because as a player, that's what you're constantly looking for. You're wanting that baited hook to come your way. And as a GM, you need to, that's your job. That's how you get them to do what you want them to do. It's not to force them. It's to throw this hook out there and make it juicy enough that there really isn't another choice. You know?
Yeah, every GM is sitting on the dock with the fishing rod, just come on, come on.
Little fishies. So I think one of the things that I really, really like to do that I have just recently discovered, probably in the last 3 years or so. The first time that I did this was with my White Lotus Black Jade game, and that went much, much better than any other campaign I'd ever run before. And I think largely because of these things that I'm asking my players for up front. And I have like basically like a list. Give me 2 NPC connections at least. You can make them up if you'd like. At least one PC connection in their party. Give me at least 1 secret. It may not have to be something that your character knows. It could be unknown to them, but just you tell me what that is. And then I've started doing a 10-question questionnaire that I stole from Dread. And it's very, very pointed questions. So it's things like, why did you kill your brother? So it's things that they may not have thought about before they came to the table, but for some reason you're implanting that little seed, because later on in the campaign, you'll be able to introduce somebody who knows the truth. And, they may be like, oh, shit, that's right. That was in my thing. And they have a prepared response because they've been primed with those questions. So I do those things, and then I also do a list that I call the COPE list, which is the commonalities of player expectations. So I ask everybody, okay, we're running an Arthurian-themed game. What is Arthurian to you? What is it that you're looking for out of this campaign? And I take those answers and I compile them into a list, and everything that gets an additional mention by someone rises higher up the list. And so what that gives me going into the campaign is literally a shopping list that I can go to and say, okay, I haven't done anything with a jousting tournament yet, and 3 of the players said that they wanted to see that. So I'm going to put that in this campaign, in this next session.
Yeah, I think like something that I think both of you brought up that is like very important is like starting off in the first session. Like it's much more important to like hook the characters than it is to like necessarily hook like the story, because there's always going to be chances to get into the big thing. So you don't necessarily have to like introduce the big bad and all these story information first. Like the easiest way to kind of hook everything together, at least that I found, and especially I know what hooks me in as a player, is, finding out who this character that I'm playing actually is. And you get a lot more of that through like individual interaction on a small scale than necessarily trying to like rush into this big overarching good versus evil, epic tale. So I think kind of being able to start off on that note is hugely important. And I will say I was surprised because I tend to be the sort of player who leaves a lot to be discovered through play. So when kind of Jeremy and some other people first kind of pitched the Dread questionnaire thing to me, I was like, I don't know about this because you know I don't want to like lock myself down a road just to walk down it and realize it's not the road that I wanted to be on. But I've actually found that it's done the opposite for me, where it's easier to improvise to a background than it is to pull something out of thin air. So being able to have something to tie off of, I found makes it a lot easier for me to start riffing off of that concept than it is if you just say, do whatever you want. Just kind of this paralysis of choice that comes with that. I think if you can reduce that and kind of funnel it down into a more tangible spot, that even more improv oriented players will be benefited by that, by their ability to riff off of an idea and a theme that's been created between the GM and the players rather than having to like decide all this on the fly and try to inject it in and hope that it works with what everybody else is doing. The more foundation you can lay, the easier it is to improv, not the more restrictive it is to it.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And that's, I don't want to get too much into character stuff, but the way that you create characters in L5R, filling out this 20 questions, it's really time consuming. It takes a lot of like mental energy. And when you first sit down and do it, I find that the first reaction people have is like, wow, this is a lot. And like, I don't think I'm going to need this. But it creates so many tools in your toolbox, not only for you, but the GM as well. All of a sudden has built-in NPCs that they can be like, ooh, I'm going to use that person. I'm going to use that person. Like there was an NPC on Lloyd's sheet for the L5R campaign that I put both of them. He had two NPCs on his sheet, and I used both of them at certain points in the campaign to like great effect. And like ultimately, like your job as a GM is to like emotionally manipulate your players based on things they've told you. And like something like a questionnaire like that, or just not even just a questionnaire, but like what you're talking about, Jeremy, with like the little shopping list of stuff of what they want. It's like, this is literally what they want to have happen in the campaign. So I'm going to use those things both to give them cool stuff, but also I'm going to use it against them to create these really tough, interesting situations and difficult decisions that they'll have to make throughout the campaign.
The big secret of GMing is really summed up down to that, and it's so few people do it. Ask people what they want and give it to them, but not exactly. Done. Like that really does get you 90% of the way there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely giving them what they want in an unexpected way with a little bit of a dagger in it. Like it's like, oh yes, you know, that's right. It was in my back. Oh, you're an asshole. Okay, thanks. But at the same time, okay, like I'm okay with this because it adds that depth immediately to your character. You know, like Matt said, you know, the whole game is based on conflict and tension. That's the intention of why we're sitting down to play these games. Typically, those are where all of the drama is. So if you can find ways to feed your players straight through that emotional meat grinder, then take it. Like absolutely take it. And most players, good players at least, will openly discuss what their ambitions and goals and desires are for the game. If you just ask them, just say, hey, where do you see your character going? What do you want out of this? What kind of game are you wanting? You know, hey, do you want explosions? Okay, you know, we'll try to figure out a way to work that into the game somehow. Like it doesn't have to be all secretive and on the sly, which is what I think a lot of people try to approach it with. Like, oh, hey, I've got this really powerful combination of this racial feature and this feat together. I can't wait to, you know, spring it on everybody, you know, and be able to surprise everyone with my ingenuity. I mean, yeah, that's great, but at the same time, just be upfront about it, and then your GM can give you a reason to use it and make it awesome.
That's kind of the key point. Is like the more secretive you are about that sort of thing, the more chances that you have that you won't actually get to do them because nobody will know that you want to do them. So if you like build up this super amazing like social intrigue character who can like do all this courtly noble talking, and then you get into the game and it's like, all right, you're on the battlefields of war, combat's going everywhere, and you're like, oh, but I all my cool courtly features. What am I supposed to do with those? But if you had just said that you had those things and you were excited about them, then you get to do those things and look as cool as you were hoping that your character would look. And as a GM, asking people for what they want and being able to provide it in a different way, as you said, is such a huge tool that gets underused. Like the secretness of it is much less important than it actually showing up. So don't hide it, because then it might not actually ever happen, and then it's help to nobody.
A secret is no good if nobody ever finds out about it. You know, a lot of my wife hated me because I kept drawing her character's secrets. She played an assassin in our in the Asian themed game, so she was like this geisha assassin, and I was constantly like pulling her business kind of out into the light, like in small ways, and she was so furious with me. She's like, "Why do you keep telling everybody that that's going on in the background?" I'm like, because if nobody ever finds out, it's never going to be interesting to anyone else. But the moment that that happens, when somebody finally figures out what's going on and calls you on it, that is where the honey is, because that scene is going to be fantastic.
Yeah, the Chekhov's gun doesn't do anyone any good if you don't take it off the wall and shoot it.
Exactly. It takes so much work to like set all these things up as a GM and as a player. So like don't find reasons to make your hard work less effective. Like there's just no reason to spend so much time gathering all this secret information and building up these plot lines like all behind your own little wall, and then like just hoping and praying that your players will like gravitate towards the things that you super care about. Like there's no reason to hope. Like you can just set those things up and make people aware of it. And if you have a good set of players, then they're going to make it exciting, even if it's like, even if you know it's going to happen. Like even if you don't have to like know even all the details, but like you can be aware that things are going to happen, generally speaking, and still have them be like super thrilling when they do happen, because it's as cool, if not cooler, than you hoped it was going to be.
Yeah. Do we have any questions? Didn't look like we have any in the chat just yet, but I know that we had some that were preloaded.
Yeah, let's see if there's some specific stuff that's kind of related. So I think kind of going into kind of including player elements here, there was a question from Mike Lasham, fantastic GM and player in his own right. He asks, when delving into characters' backstories for quest lines, do you find it better to like stretch that out over the game, or to kind of do it more of an episode where you kind of explore and resolve that character's quest line like in a session where they're kind of the focus of it? Or do you find it better to kind of make it more of a long running thing?
I think I like having little breadcrumbs that lead to a very like momentous sort of climactic thing. And I do this with a lot of characters, and like I feel like in the Provokers, like every character had like an episode that was like, okay, we're going to their place and we're going to meet NPCs from their past and we're going to learn more about them. And all of these little hints and clues that myself and the player have been dropping throughout the campaign are all going to come to a head here at this moment. And so I prefer to have it be like a very punchy, like maybe one session thing that focuses on that character and their thing, because otherwise then the campaign starts to slow down a little bit. It starts to slog a little bit because you're focusing on one character and maybe even deviating a little bit from kind of like the main sort of crux of the campaign. So I really like it's all coming to a head right now. Like this is the session. This is the Durgan session, or this is the dice session, or whatever. That's how I prefer to do it, is like have it be a big thing, have it be the point of an episode or a session.
I'm very similar, except that I usually don't have it take up an entire session, depending on what it is. So I definitely really like to seed a little here and there, and especially if I can find ways that take two different players' paths and kind of make them weave together. That's very rewarding if I can ever figure out those kinds of situations. So that way, whenever I kind of pluck on that little string, it resonates further out in the party. And I like to do some of those along the path of kind of where I feel the story is going. So that way, it's not ever really the reason that they're going somewhere or what they're doing. It's typically a part of the reason. So this other thing is also going on there. It's not just to go visit so and so's brother. It's your brother is now caught in this thing that's going on, and you got to go figure out what's going on. So that way, it both furthers the kind of story that I'd like to tell, but also works their narrative into it and kind of is the driving, kind of the engine behind the story.
Yeah, I think something you said there is something that I'm like hugely believe in when it comes to like using backstory. Is like for me, I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not. I haven't really talked about it, but it's something that I've been interested in kind of lately. As far as backstory, I'm kind of the opinion that like backstory is only as important as like the conflict or resolution to character growth that it brings to the game now. So it's like if you're going to bring in a player's backstory, it should either pit the character against the primary conflict or help to resolve some aspect of the primary conflict. But I think kind of the amount of time that you spend, whether that's over a long time or a short time, is I guess mostly for me depends on how is this actually relating to the characters themselves and like what that it ties in. Because I think a lot of people will come in with like nondescript backstory elements and then like wonder why they're not getting used. Where it's just like, oh, I have a family, and it's like you know nothing about this family or like how it's going to tie into the game, and then like, well, I have all these people and all these stories. Like, why aren't these coming into the game? Um, but it's like if it's not forwarding the progress of the game, then it can kind of either feel like it was thrown in just to be like, all right, here's your backstory, here's your brother. But it's like Jeremy said, if this brother's not tied into the conflict, he's in danger because of the story, or maybe he's in danger to the party because he's helping. And it's like, whoa, this now the player has to fight against their admiration for their brother versus resolving the conflict of the party and kind of using it as a story beat rather than just like as a token additions to the game because people made it up.
And I will throw a point in there also. That's why it's a really good idea to leave your NPCs, locations, things like that, very undefined as far as you can out front. Because that way, when you get to a chance where you get to work in this theoretical brother that we've been talking about, and you have this other idea for an NPC, all of a sudden they can be one and the same, and it makes your story thread so much stronger, because instead of continuing to branch out in all these different directions, you're constantly weaving those threads back together onto themselves, and your story becomes so much tighter that way in the end.
Yeah, it all comes back to like your job as a GM is to emotionally manipulate the players. And if you have elements of their backstory at your disposal, like why wouldn't you use those in service to the story that is being told and put them in the way of the players, create obstacles and like weaknesses that can be exploited? And like that sounds very like mean to say it that way, but like that's how conflict and story happens, is tough decisions and things that can be lost and won. And I feel like those are really what the backgrounds are there for, is to be utilized in the telling of the story, in the greater collaborative story.
And a lot of people I've noticed are really hesitant to give that kind of information for their character. Like, oh, I don't want to give, potential ammunition. I don't want to give you something that you can take away. But the truth is, like, that, again, that's where the great part comes in, because when those things are targeted or damaged or taken away or killed or whatever, that creates incredibly strong moments at the table, really emotional moments if the players are invested enough. And I think a lot of people, that's what you're after.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As a player, I want to hand the GM like a list of all the things that are important to my character and say, okay, now use these to ruin me, please. Like, I want you to ruin me.
Exactly. Like, yeah, backstory is like all a matter of like adding stakes to the character, like having this matter to them in a way. So if the backstory is not making it matter, then it's probably not serving its purpose. But the more you can have it be directly tied into your character now, what they want versus their obligations and things like that, which is, I think, something that the L5R, to kind of bring that up again, does really well. Is like every character has like a duty and also a desire, and those things are meant to be opposed to each other. So there's kind of this recurring built-in conflict that the GM always has to take. And I think kind of when you ask players for backstory elements, like make sure that you're keeping that kind of thing in mind of like how is this going to cross paths versus other people. Um, and as Jeremy said, there's even the next level deeper that you can take to that then, which is like how does one character's backstory and motivation fight against another character's in the party's backstory and motivation? And if you can put something on the line that forces one or the other, you can kind of even push the issue further. But for me, it kind of all comes down to those elements, like those backstory character motivation elements are going to get you a lot further than like a, a big plot element, at least for me personally, and the way that I tend to run and play.
Yeah, like it's a much bigger deal as a GM to think like, oh, I'm going to destroy the city, and rather than saying like, I'm going to destroy the city where this character grew up. Like that's going to be a stake in the campaign. And I also want to mention too that when you get those things from the players and when you like get those background elements and become aware of them, you aren't necessarily going to know what you want to do with those right away. And there might be a few ideas that pop into your head, but I'd rather have those things than not as the campaign goes forward, and then have those things to fall back on as tools that I can use. And like in the L5R trilogy that I just ran, like I knew that Taylor's character was like really obsessed with like who her dad was and like wanting to find out like why everyone was so hush hush about her parentage. And I didn't know what I was going to do with that, if she was going to like meet her dad or if that was going to be a thing that happened. And then I was able to really use that in the third session as this demon is like conversing with her and he's able to mock her with this information. It's like, I didn't know what I was going to do with that at first, but it was something that I was able to, as I was prepping that third session, oh, hey, there's something I can use for her character in this session. Like I'll pull that because I haven't used that yet.
Yeah, and something that I just played in a session on Monday of a L5R game that Chris Wilhelm is running. Something that he did in that game that I really, really liked was he basically, I think it's in the book, but there's like a wheel that you can put like each character's motivations on, like their duty versus their desires, and then you roll dice on that circle, and you basically end up with two elements of character backstories that you're going to work in, but in opposition to each other. So, like, he rolled on basically Tyler's character in that game is trying to restore his honor, and I am basically working as under a secret identity as a shinobi to undermine his honor. But like he basically rolled those two things in opposition. Where there's a scenario that came up that's like, depending on how we act, only one of our motivations can be furthered. Either we accomplish this successfully and he gets honor, or I find a way to undermine it and it helps my own mission. But it kind of forced an emotional conflict because he could take elements of like his backstory and his backstory are kind of mutually exclusive in which one of them can be resolved, at least right now. So if you can kind of even using tools like that to kind of force conflict in a way, I think can be really interesting. I was really happy with the way that session turned out and him describing the technique and how it worked.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Inter-party conflict is one of those kinds of things where it crops up occasionally, and depending on your table, it's either really, really awesome or really fucking horrible. So if you have a good player, a good group of players, then it's usually some of the most rewarding scenes to get through. And it's always a very interesting thing to watch people like tear at each other's throats for half an hour and then stand up and hug each other, or, ask the other one if you want a refill on their drink, or, it's immediately, one and done. But sometimes the other players don't handle it well. And they get very upset at each other. And unfortunately, that's where one of your jobs as a GM comes in, and it sucks a lot, but it's kind of your job to put out fires. And God help you if that falls on your lap.
Yeah, I tend to be a GM that very much enjoys and even stokes conflict between the players intentionally, but it's also something that I try to make everybody aware of beforehand. Of like, you've given me these buttons so that we can push them. So please, when we do, be ready to handle it like an adult. And it really just comes down to making sure that the game and the group are not the same thing. Like when it comes to conflict, there's a very, very huge difference between two characters who are neck and neck at each other and two players who are neck and neck at each other. So you just have to manage and make sure that when things are happening in the game, that sometimes to just check in with everybody to make sure that what's happening that they're okay with. I remember I was playing in a game where Lloyd was running, and he put a situation that was like really, really tense and uncomfortable. But in the side chat, he just checked in and was like, "Hey, just want to make sure that I know this is a lot. Is this too much? Do I need to pull back? Do we need to cut this? Or is everybody okay to keep going and push forward?" And just knowing that sometimes if you're going to really turn up the heat, it's totally okay to pop in the chat and be like, is this too much for anybody? Do we need to pull back? Can we push forward? Is this okay? And I think there's kind of too many people just assume that something will be okay or won't be okay, and they'll either push too far or not do something cool that they could have done because they're worried. And again, that kind of goes back to ask people and they will tell you. And as long as you can keep everybody open and honest with each other, then you can really turn up the heat sometimes with some of the actual character conflict.
It's funny how often the answers to problems that we have at the table is, have you tried talking to your group? Like, have you tried talking to your players? Because most of the time just communicating and, like you're saying, asking, what do you guys want, will solve a lot of the problems that you're having, whether it be in prep, in running the game, in handling the group dynamic. Like, just talk to the players. It'll help.
I think a common pitfall that a lot of newer DMs tend to seem to fall into is that you should know everything up front somehow, that you're omniscient and you've got it all figured out, and it's all going to go according to plan. And even in situations like that, when there's a problem player or when my players don't seem interested, a lot of it boils down to a lack of communication. Because every relationship, it doesn't matter what it is, a marriage, a business relationship, a gaming relationship, communication is the biggest important factor in any relationship. That's the foundation. And if you don't have a solid method of communicating with all parties involved, there's going to be problems. That's where most problems stem from. And if you just talk it out ahead of time, or even whenever things get bad, you can usually find a solution relatively easy.
Yeah, if you could build like a chat bot to put into Absolute Tabletop, where any person that tags their post advice, you just said like, ask people and listen to them, like that would be more accurate to whatever thread is than not, like by a vast amount. Like it really is that simple sometimes. Of if there's a problem, ask somebody and then honestly listen to them and try to help. Like whether it's conflict or interest or whatever else. Like I think kind of getting into like player motivations and adding things in. I think there's a couple questions that came up about like players like adding their own things into games and like how far that can be pushed. So Keel, Adam, again, a great player, asks Like, how much input do you have your players put in towards prominent elements in a game? Do you actively encourage it? He uses the example of Barker in The Provokers, of Dice's daughter being in Foul Hast, that kind of adds in an extra layer of stakes to the game, and like whether or not, like, how much as a GM do you allow your players to, with or without your knowledge, add in elements to the campaign, and at what level? Like adding in little things versus adding in massive story shaking elements. Like, where do you guys kind of fall?
I love that, and honestly, like it's part of the like real magic of RPGs is like I just created something that wasn't there before, and now it exists in this world that we are collaboratively like involved in and creating together. And so for me, it's one of the greatest joys is having a player create something within the world that we are inhabiting together. So I'm all for things that are going to shake up the story, things that drastically change the way that I know their character. And really, I know I keep mentioning this, but this is just the campaign I just finished. Lloyd, in the last session of the L5R game, dropped a complete bomb on all of us. And I don't want to spoil it if you haven't watched it yet, but it completely changes the way that you see his character and the way that I saw his character. It wasn't even something that I knew. It was something that completely shaked it up. But I was like, that's really cool. I love that. Like, that threw me for a loop and it surprised me. And for me, one of the great joys of GMing is when your players surprise you. And so anytime anyone wants to add something to the world, create something that wasn't there before, hey, I know this guy who can help us. He's an NPC in this town. We should go there. I'm all for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for me, there is one kind of line that I will draw of like things that like add depth to like their character is obviously always great. Anything that they can do to raise their own stakes, to heighten their motivations and heighten depth to their character is obviously amazing. And there's a lot that you can even add outside in the world. Um, I do think that there's a danger of like adding things that like fundamentally change like the culture of the place that you're in, and like being aware of, if you're playing in like Lloyd's Viking setting, and you should be aware of things that you add in fitting into that culture. You wouldn't want to put in something that's going to undermine like what that place is about. And obviously most players will be mindful of that sort of thing, but that's always the worry of when you have people, especially kind of make up on the fly big picture elements. If it works against like the fundamental pillar of your setting in an important way, that's kind of where I'll maybe pull the brakes. But the vast majority of times, um, anything that they can do to add in things that'll make them more interested in the game or make them feel like they're a part of the world who are creating the world, that's always a great thing. Anything that you can do to tie them in further is going to help a lot. But at least for me, and even some people will be okay with players adding just literally anything into the world. And that's a totally fine way to do it. For me, there's always that little bit of hesitation when it comes to like giant things of like, I don't want this to destroy kind of the entire point. Like if I'm building a certain thread, a plot thread, or a tonal idea, and what they're going to put in is going to like totally destroy that. For me, that kind of turns me off as a GM. But again, that's kind of more of a style thing than like a hard rule that I'm willing to declare. But overall, players adding stuff is great. Raises their stakes, raises their investment, gives you more things to work with, and it kind of builds the best part of RPGs, which is the collaboration that you have between everybody.
I would second that. I would love to have everybody add in stuff, and even big cataclysmic or world-changing additions. The only thing that I do say is that I typically have the right of veto, or at least the right of like manipulating, and shaping a little bit of what you said to kind of make it fit the overall, like you said, the tone or the theme of the campaign that we're working on. And part of that, I think, is, again, session zero. Like, you can lay a lot of that out ahead of time, and if your players are paying attention, then the things that they'll be looking to add are only things that are going to help further shape the story and the setting in the direction that you're wanting to go, because you've established what direction you want to go in the very, very beginning. Again, communication.
Yep, absolutely. And kind of like you say, being able to present that information up top, and kind of set the outer boundaries, can do a lot towards making improvisation within the framework that much easier. If you kind of know where the edges are, um, that way you can know when you're going to make something up on the spot that it's not going to like land totally outside of the line. And kind of when it comes to presenting information, we actually got a question about that, so that's kind of a nice tie-in there. Of as far as it's always kind of one of the most awkward and difficult parts of starting a campaign, especially in a new setting, of how do you tell the players about the world without it just being like, here's a 30-page document about the world, please read it. Obviously, that's not ideal, but having them know nothing is not great, um, either. And we had a question from Thomas Frey in the group, which said, like, how do you get, from what perspective do you guys present lore to the players? Like, if they're, like, if the level of knowledge between like royalty and commoners and stuff is going to be a big difference, do you tell them about the world from the top down perspective, or do you kind of give them more of a ground up version of the world based off of their own characters? How do you kind of navigate the front loaded portion of starting a game in a setting where the players don't know the setting?
I'm really fond of campaign primers, and the first time I ever saw one was in the, I think it was in the Eberron, I think it was in the 3.5 Eberron campaign setting guide, where they had the 10 things you need to know about Eberron. And it was just like the 10 sort of pillars of the world. And I feel like that is probably as much information as I'm willing to dump on players before a campaign starts. It's like, here's the basics. Because I'm really fond of show, don't tell. I want the players to see the world. I want them to inhabit it, and I want them to experience it through the eyes of their characters rather than from like a top-down sort of like sterile view of like reading lore on a page. It's much more fun to walk through the rice paddies of Rokugan and have the peasants go out of their way to move aside to let you pass, completely, standing in the muck and the mud to let the samurai pass, than it is to tell the players, okay, here's the deal with samurai, here's how important they are, and here's what the peasants would do if you pass by them. It's like, let the players experience those things, those cultural things, the main sort of pillars of your world. Let them see them firsthand, and then like just lay it on as it goes. Because if you try and dump lore on them beforehand, it's just going to be too much, and they're not going to retain it anyway. It's not going to mean anything for them because they don't have a context for it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have a pretty basic philosophy, which is literally the minimum amount of information that you can tell them and have them still get it is like, that's how much you should say, and like not more than that. So like the way that I usually like to do it is basically give them like 5 to 6 like setting campaign pillars of like, this is like what's necessary to know about the world to be able to like make a character. But if they're gonna start in one town, you don't need to tell them about 4 others. Like, just, it's easier, at least in my opinion, to like give them just the very, very basic groundwork. And then there's nothing wrong with asking questions as the game goes along of like, oh, I don't know what religion is like in this world. Can you give me the quick rundown? Because I'm about to go into a church and and my character's a priest, so I should probably know what I'm talking about. And it's like, give them what's essential to their characters for them to make their characters, and what's like essential for them to like start in the actual world, and no more than that. Like, everything else can come out through play, like Matt said. Showing, not telling, is so much more powerful and so much more impressive than trying to dump it all and like hope that it sinks in.
Yeah, especially whenever you're talking about world building, which is this is kind of getting into a little bit. You're never ever going to fully detail your world. Never. Like, you just simply cannot put in that much information. a world is an infinitely intricate thing, and you're never going to be able to detail it all out. So just don't. Like you said, have your basic tenets, if you will, kind of laid out in front of you and surrounded around you. All of your things should tie into those somehow, and let your players just know what those basic tenets are. And then make sure that you're sticking to those as the tenets. And that will reinforce the tone or the what is appropriate for your players, and they'll be more apt to feed right back into that that same feeling that you're trying to go. And then at some point, you get to just take your hand off the wheel, and you can tell that they understand, they get it, and they further your story along much better than you ever could.
Yeah. There's I think people again, I think underrate or overrate like having to know everything ahead of time and have it all set up. Like it's I think for me as a player and as a GM, like I'd much rather go into situations and be like, you see this guy, he's got a gray cloak with this symbol on it. By the way, you know that that cloak and that symbol means this. Like you tell them because they're seeing this guy, the characters would know it, but you don't need to go out of your way like at the beginning of the session be like, here's a document with all the factions that you would know. It's just like you see a guy in this faction, here's what that faction is because you probably have seen one before. Like that's gonna get you a lot further than trying to like prime everybody ahead of time to all the details. Like if you can give them the feeling of the world, that's what's much more important. It's like, what does it feel like to play in this session? If you can impart that at the start, then you're golden. And the details of the world, you can build all that as it goes because you don't need to know that ahead of time.
That's like gospel truth. And also like never forget, like we live in a world and we don't know everything about it. And like I'm constantly like, what? That's a thing? I didn't know that. Like, where's my Earth lore document that I needed to read in order to know these things? It's okay for even characters to not know things in the world. Like, I've never heard of this faction. I didn't know about this temple to this god or whatever. Like, that's okay. You don't know everything about the world, especially in most D&D settings, which are like medieval fantasy, where like you pretty much know what happens in a 5-mile radius and that's about it.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of kind of setting players up at the start, we got a question in the chat here from Lloyd, the great Jarl DM, which is, sorry, I just saw Jason in the chat. Someone make an Earthlore document. I need it, right? Yeah, please. Lloyd has a question, which is how much do you guys value session zeros? He said, I've kind of gone off them doing planning via documents mostly rather than an actual live session zero. Do you think the actual like live over hangouts talking vocally session zeros are those important, or can you kind of get away with mostly group chats and interest posts and that sort of thing? What do you guys tend to lean toward?
I think this is going to waver from group to group. It really just kind of depends on the DM and the players. For me personally, I thrive very, very much off of conversational interaction. So being able to even to joke around, to feel out the chemistry between everybody, because like when I'm running the game, that's what I'm relying on anyways. It's not going to be somebody's knowledge of my world. It's going to be how well they're playing off of everyone else and me. So that's what I want to test out in a session zero. Yes, we're going over, rules and how to handle critical hits and all of that mechanical bullshit. But it's also the how are we going to gel as a group? How are we going to function? Who's going to be the person who ends up kind of taking the lead because that's just their personality type? Who's going to be the shy one that I need to pay attention to and make sure that I shine the spotlight on more? That's the kind of stuff that I'm looking for in a session zero. So to me, they're invaluable.
Yeah, I think the less you know the group that you're playing with, the more valuable an in-person session zero is going to be. I think that Lloyd can kind of get away with less in-person session zeros because most of his games are going to have me and they're going to have Nico and they're going to have, it's going to be more or less the same kind of core group of people. And once you kind of know how we're all going to interact, the roles that we kind of play, the characters that we like to bring, the less it becomes important to put that all in stone ahead of time and kind of feel it out. But if I was going to play in a game with, one or two people that I knew and then two people that I've never played with in my entire life, then I think a live session zero becomes a lot more valuable because you can kind of fish out their personalities and kind of hear their philosophy on the game and kind of get their ideas of how they want to play and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I'm a fan of session zeros, especially if it's like you guys were saying, players you're not super familiar with, but also if I'm playing in like a new system or a new setting, it's always good to kind of get on the same page about things. Especially if it's just a system that you're all learning, you're all coming to the table. It's like we need to figure out what kind of characters we're playing so we don't all make the same guy in this game mechanically. You know what I mean? So I definitely appreciate session zeros for that as well, and I think it's important.
Yep, that's a big point too. Like the session zero for the L5R game that I played in was way, way, way more valuable to me than like a session zero for a 5e game that I'm gonna play in because I have no idea what the hell I'm doing in L5R. So having somebody to be able to be like, these are the kinds of roles that you can play in the world. These are the mechanics of the game that we can sort out together and kind of get an idea. It's like you say, especially when it's a new system and everyone's just kind of throwing paint at the wall and seeing what sticks. You can end up with situations where everyone's like, all right, I'm really excited to build this ninja character. And then you get into the campaign and you have like 3 ninjas and 1 like straight up samurai. And it's like, what are these people supposed to do with each other?
I will have you know that 3
No,
Ninjas
awesome.
was an amazing gemstone of a film. No, it wasn't. I'm sorry. It was not worth.
Where's the 3 Ninjas Fate game? Where is it?
Alan, we need you. Get
Interest
up
post.
front.
I want to see it. We're calling you out.
I'm sorry to railroad all over your the end of your statement there, Jeff.
No,
but yes,
that was
I
basically
agree.
the end of it. Is yeah, you can kind of sort out get people's feelings for what they want to do and what they want to be, especially if it's unfamiliar territory, or I think like a world with like a lot of cultural significance, like L5R does, where it's like you need to know if you're going into a court place that this sort of behavior is unacceptable, and if you do it, you're gonna die. Like when you have kind of that high level of cultural expectation, like session zeros can do a lot. So you can kind of lay some of that groundwork and make sure that the understanding is there.
Yeah, I agree. Okay.
So there was actually a couple questions that we got from a couple different people that I think would kind of be an interesting thing to kind of tag and see what you guys. We had a lot of people asking about like favorite organizational tools, favorite kind of things that you use to help plan or prep or kind of manage your campaigns. So like for me, the easy one to start off with is if your game doesn't have a set time, like Doodle to schedule games is like just a game changer if you don't use it. Like it's so makes it so much easier. As far as actual campaign notes organization, I'm a bad person to ask because I basically have like 9 different Google Docs with like 20% overlap of information across each individual page. And I'm bad at taking notes in general. So I don't have a whole lot of extra tools outside of like I have some stuff in a Google Doc and I use Doodle to schedule, but some people like swear by certain like boards and different things that they use. So if you guys have any individual things that you guys like to use to help manage NPC lists or character goals, or how do you guys kind of the organizational side of campaigns, what do you guys like to do?
I've recently become enamored with OneNote, which is something that I've heard people talk about like consistently for a few years of like you should manage your campaigns in OneNote. But I've always been like a Google Docs guy just because it's so easy to access anywhere, and I usually work on multiple computers and stuff. But OneNote is all it has cloud functionality now. So I used OneNote for my L5R campaign, and I think I'm going to use that going forward, specifically for campaigns, just because it's so easy to. You have tabs, and within those tabs, you can have pages. And so, like for L5R, I had like a tab that was like PCs, a tab that was NPCs, a tab that was session prep, and then within that session prep tab, I had pages for each session, and then I had a tab that was like just random like names. If I needed to come up with a name of an NPC, all the family names for each clan, what each family was kind of responsible for within the clan, because it's like good information to have on hand. And I found that I really liked that because it was really easy to like dump art in there, really easy to create tables if you need to create tables. Like it's just whatever you need it to be. And you just create text boxes and format them however you want. And so I usually had like, for my session prep, I would have like, my main bulk of the notes. And then off to the side, I would have a little sidebar with like a bulleted list of like, these are the scenes I think are going to happen. So I can very easily like just look over and see, okay, here's all the things that I want to have happen. And then I can reference them back in the main list or whatever. And so I really enjoyed using OneNote, and I think I'm going to use that a little bit more. It's a really sort of versatile tool. And being able to save things on the cloud is, of course, very nice, because then I can get to it on my laptop, on my phone, whatever.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm going to have to check that out. I have likewise heard a lot of people talk about it, but it's just not something I've ever really dove into. I use Dropbox a lot because I run very art-heavy games, especially. It's really, really easy to move things, like you said, to the cloud. So I can, if I find something at work that I come across, I can sneak it in there on my phone. Here at home. So it kind of helps me keep everything together. Trying to think, Doodle is also a very, very useful tool that I learned about a little while ago for scheduling. And it's free, and so it's perfect. As far as like personal tools, not necessarily software. Again, I mentioned the Cope thing earlier. Those kinds of tools help me out a lot in figuring out what I want to bring to the table for a session. And I also have a document that I kind of start at the very, very beginning of a campaign called the Scramble. And it's literally just me copying and pasting like entries from Wikipedia, or typing out just a single sentence of an idea that I had, or whatever, and copying and pasting and dumping that all into one document. And then going through and organizing it. Okay, this is all empty information. These are all ideas for traps. Kind of breaking it down through the document like that. So that way, later on, if I'm like, oh man, I really want to put a trap in this particular encounter, I can go, wait a second. I'll go to my Scramble document and go down to where I have traps and be like, this one right here. And I'll grab it and put it in there and then expand on it and flesh it out. So it's a really useful document for me to have.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, one of those you gotta kind of experiment and just kind of see what works best for your brain, because everyone's kind of way about going about it is going to be a little bit different. And there's not really a ultimate right method. It's just kind of try out different things, and if something's like, oh, yep, this is the one. Like, I think a lot of people will kind of have a click moment like that.
I also like float from thing to thing just constantly. Like the thing is always like, oh, this is it. This is the one I'm going to use. And then like I'll be prepping for a session and I'm like, nah, this isn't working. I got to use something else. Like I was using Trello for a while, which is like a productivity board. I was using that a lot and I was really loving it. And then it like got to the point where it was like unwieldy and I was like, okay, I got to do something else. So I feel like at a certain point, maybe OneNote will become that way for me too. And I'll go back to like scratch marks on napkins running my session that way, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm the same way, where there's like a degree to which like the novelty of the new thing is what makes it interesting, rather than like its actual like long-term usefulness. Where it's very much just like whatever works. I mean, and this is just kind of how I am with all like my prep, even game prep. It's just like whatever works in that moment is the thing that I use, and sometimes that'll be the same thing for 3 months, and sometimes it'll be different, literally every single day. So just. But I'm also, again, not the. If you're looking for masterful organization, I am not the person to look for, because that is not my forte. We do have a question from Lloyd that just came into the chat, which I think is really interesting. What do you do when the focus of a campaign shifts? So he gives an example in the Iskloft game that we played yesterday. We conquered a town, so we were basically Reaving crew, but we like successfully raided and took over a town with the plans to stay there and build the town up. So basically, we started off as like Reaving crew pirates, basically Vikings, but now it's kind of potentially it could turn into like a civilization management campaign, or we could go off and continue to find adventuring things to do elsewhere. But if you find yourself in a situation where perhaps even without your planning or awareness that it was going to happen, that the focus of the game completely changes to what the original pitch was, what would kind of be your initial go-to in that situation?
I find that kind of stuff really exciting, and I really I love when that kind of stuff happens, and I think that's sort of the heart of just going with the flow and letting the story kind of tell itself through the players and the collaborative story. So for me, it would just be a matter of kind of redirecting my focus and thinking about it's not necessarily okay, I've got to throw everything out or take all of this idea, take all of these ideas I had and throw them in the trash, but how can I utilize these ideas in a different way now that's going to work with the players' new goals? Because they've gone from, reaving along the coastline to putting down roots and trying to build up a town, and actually are sort of, becoming settlement builders. And it's well, what threats are going to threaten them now? And how can I now they're out of their element. You know what I mean? You guys are out of your element now that you're building a town. And so it's almost, as a GM, it's an opportunity to throw completely new threats at you, and use those ideas that they had, but in a completely new way. So I would, it would be very easy to get kind of dismayed at something like that of oh, wow, I had this idea for this campaign. Now it's totally different. It's no, it's the campaign's taking on a life of its own. And that's a testament to the GM, testament to the players. So get excited about it and see it as an opportunity.
Yeah, there's almost this mini game that I play as a DM, and it's always the to quote the meme, why not both? It's when players throw an idea at me that changes the way I saw things going. What I spend my effort and my mental energy on doing is building a bridge between those two things, so that they aren't desperate ideas. They're not these divorced things that don't have anything to do with one another. The really interesting part of the story can happen from why both of these things are true at the same time. So when you can figure out a way to connect ideas that you didn't expect to what you had originally planned, and kind of find a compromise between the two, your story becomes much more deep, and it's still rooted in both what the players wanted by showing you and telling you what they wanted to go after, and kind of what you might have been planting seeds for all along.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would particularly keep in mind, especially because I've seen this sort of thing happen before, and it can be really frustrating, is the first thing is to take stock of what the players and the characters are doing in the game and what they're going to do in this different new environment, and making sure that everybody still has a place and a purpose that they can fill. So I think it can be easy to all right, I've made my barbarian smasher guy. He's got 20 strength and he's just gonna beat people down, and I can't wait for all these awesome combats that I'm gonna be in where I get to just rip people apart. And then the game suddenly turns into a courtly intrigue game, and you're playing a barbarian with an 8 intelligence, 8 wisdom, 10 charisma, and a 30 strength. And it's okay, well, I kind of made this character with the intent to fight, and that was something that was important to me. So making sure that if people have built very specific character motivations in, or mechanical character functions into the game, to kind of take stock of those things and how you can still make sure that everybody gets what they want, even in the new direction. And there's usually ways to continue to make things work, even if the game changes space. And I think kind of another underrated tool with unexpected plot twists. is like most of your ideas that you have, you can like still use them. Like people kind of, I think, get too locked into like an idea like being executed in exactly a specific way where it's like, oh, but I had this awesome idea for this dragon encounter up on this mountain, and now they're not going to go to that mountain. Like, what am I supposed to do? And it's like you can take that and just like put it somewhere else. Like if you have an awesome idea that you're really excited about, there's probably going to be a way for you to still work those things in to the game no matter what direction it goes if the world can kind of is made to support those sorts of things. Um that would be what I would do. Take stock of what the characters want, how they're going to function in the Switch, and then if you have something you're excited about, you can probably still do it. You might have to tweak it a little bit, but it's all still there.
Yeah, and that's again a reason for keeping your things malleable and not set in stone, because it gives you the chance to, if it's a square hole, put a square peg. If it's a round hole, put a round peg. You don't have to define what kind of peg it is ahead of time. You get to decide right when the moment is there, based on what your players have given you. So you have to leave yourself room to finish shaping what it is that's finish shaping the element that you're going to be injecting into the game.
I think I see almost no GMs do this, but now that I've seen a couple start to do it, it's like totally blown my mind. Of like before a session, ask what your players are planning on doing in that session, and then you can kind of build around that. Like it's such a simple thing, but if the game's going to be a matter of like, oh well, they might sail across the sea or they might plant down and build this town, you can just go to the players and say, all right, guys, you have a choice. Like obviously we'll work it out all in character in the game, but I kind of need to know now what you guys are going to do. Again, it's falling back on the cliche advice of, if you don't know what to do, ask the players, and they'll tell you. Again, I hate to like say the same thing over and over again, but it really kind of is the golden rule. If the game's kind of shifting focus, touch base with the players. Be like, is this where we want to go? Because if it is, I'll plan and prep the next session so we can really dig into that, and I'll start kind of planting the seeds that way. If we want to find a different way to go, then you can do that instead. So like, just don't be afraid to um, touch base and see what they're going to do, because then you don't have to worry about like, are they going to follow this plot line? Are they going to follow this plot line? Because you know which way they're going to go because they've told you. And unless they're totally wild card, loose cannon players who like intentionally try to kind of throw things off the rails, which there are players who do that, then you don't really have a whole lot to worry about, because you can kind of, at least even if you don't know where the entire campaign is going to go, you can know where the next session is going to go. And then from there, you can know where the next session is going to go. And then next thing you know, you have a campaign again.
I've become more and more of a fan over the recent last 2 years or so of kind of running my games with the hood open, like being totally upfront with things that normally I would have been very protective about. It's, hey, I'm going to roll randomly on this chart and we're going to figure out what happens. Or like you said, hey, this is the way that the campaign seems to be going. Is that okay with everyone? Or do we need to try to rein it back in? What do you guys need me to do? In a meta question, instead of trying to figure out some convoluted way of sorting it all out in game, it's okay to handle business and other things in a meta fashion.
Yep, I 1,000% agree. There's so many people who get like hung up over, keeping the curtain drawn across the, keeping the hood closed. And people just don't care. Like it's easy to think that that you're revealing some deep dark secret that's gonna like ruin everything. But in actuality, you're just like ensuring that things are gonna go better. And like why wouldn't you want that to happen? Uh it's like the way that they act in game is still going to be interesting and surprising. Like I promise. Like knowing that they're gonna go to this town instead of this town, like doesn't take away the fact that there's gonna be an amazing role play conversation between the two of them on the way there, whichever way that they go. All those interesting parts about their characters and like what's happening are going to be there no matter what. So I think like again, the less that you can be like secretive and just hope that what they want lines up with what you're doing, there's just no reason. Like it's that simple.
And with saying that, that doesn't mean that you can't have any kind of secrets or anything that you're
Yeah,
waiting, for a reveal. Keep some of that, but you don't have to keep quite as much of it as you might think at first. I think destroying a lot of the mysticism of being a DM is a really important thing at a table. For me, as a DM, it is. I don't want people to look at what I'm doing and think, oh man, how does the person, how I could never do that. I hate hearing people say I could never do that. It's like, if you can play the game, then you can run the game. I promise. And you should at least try it. It may not be for you. It may be something that you hate, but you at least need to understand what it is. And so if I can kind of intrigue you by showing how certain things worked, then to me, that's fantastic. I've educated someone and hopefully gained a new GM, which is never a bad thing in my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like I think too many people look at these things as like trade secrets. Like they have to like protect their confidential business contract that like nobody's allowed to know about. And that's just like not true at all. Like them knowing that you like planned in this way or that way, or that you've like asked them for input and just followed it, like that doesn't make it any less interesting. It just like makes it more accessible. And like that's a good thing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of GMs, especially newer GMs, put a lot of pressure on themselves. And it's like, I have to run a really good game and the players have to enjoy it. And it has to be an original story in a unique world. And the players can't see anything coming. And I have to like do it all myself. And it's like, no. Like the GM is a player. Like they're not portraying a character, but they're still a player at the table. And that the burden of the story should be shouldered by every single person at the table, ideally. And so there's no reason why you can't, as Jeremy said, run the game with the hood open a little bit. And I love that. I'm stealing that too. That's a really good way of saying it. Just like, let your players in a little bit into like behind that barbed curtain. What is going on behind the scenes? What are you planning? What are you prepping? What sorts of things do you as the GM want to have happen in the campaign? Because a lot of newer GMs especially assume that their role is to be there to entertain the players. And that is not the case. That's not your job. So, yeah.
I was just going to say exactly that. I think it's too many people view the GM and player relationship as like two different sides of a thing, where like the GM has to like be a performer for the players, or like be there for them to do certain things like for them. And that's just, in my experiences, not the way that the best games happen. The best games happen as a collective effort. So the more that you can be open, the more that they can help you, and the more that you can all make a good thing together, rather than like putting on the burden to yourself to like create a good product for the players. Like just have them help you make it, and then everybody will be happier and everything will be better. Like it comes down to that.
And just like we were saying before, with your players giving you what they want kind of on their sleeve, you should be able to do the same thing as a DM. Just as an example, I ran a rooftop chase scene in my Asian campaign, and I knew mechanically it was going to have to work a little bit differently. I wanted everybody to be able to basically dash every round. They just had so much ground to cover and like leaping between. I just knew that was going to have to be a thing. And we had a rogue in the party who has cunning action that allows them to. So I knew that was going to be kind of penalizing them. So I just went to the player and I said, hey, look, we're going to have a scene, and this is going to be the case. This is going to be how that's going to work. And I know that that's going to kind of nerf, your character's abilities. Let's find another way that you can get a benefit that is same, kind of the same theme, but just works mechanically in a different way. And to me, that's the kind of relationship that you need to establish with your players, because that allows you to bend the rules how you need them, but it also lets them know that it's okay maybe to start that conversation if they want to change things mechanically for something.
Yeah, exactly. It's, again, I think like as a GM, like you don't have to be like, obviously you don't want to be the god over the players where you're telling them everything and you won't let them, contribute at all, but you don't want to be their slave either. Like you should be able to have your own voice, and say what you want out of a game and what you would like to see and what would make you really happy in a game, and being able to just say that openly is going to help you out too. Because yes, you should ask your players what they want and you should give it to them, but they should ask you what you want and they should give that to you too. Like, the more you can make it a working relationship between everybody, where you're all trying to make a thing as a group, the better it's going to be. And communication and being open about it is step one and the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are running up on about an hour and a half now. Looks like we've covered quite a bit of ground. I don't know if we've gotten through all of the questions or not, but we should probably start to wrap things up sooner rather than later, I think.
We've done pretty dang good on the questions, actually.
Yeah,
there's like a couple specific ones that we didn't touch on, so I don't know if we want to call it right now. If we want to try to,
if there's one or two, and especially if they're short, let's do it.
Wrap up those last couple questions. I'm good for that. That sounds great.
Alrighty, so we have one from Alex Brady. So he wants to know, how does your advice change when it comes to running campaigns out of a module rather than as a homebrew that you're creating? To be honest, I have no idea. I've never ran a module, and it's not really something that I've done. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot to offer, but maybe you guys have some experience.
It's been so long since I've run like a campaign out of a book. I have run one shots and I've done like mini campaigns. For me, I guess it would be a similar thing where I would take it one session at a time. Especially with I think with a pre-written module, you risk the danger of falling into the trap of just like, this is what's going to happen. So yes, read through the campaign, have an idea of what sorts of things are going to happen, but also bear in mind that like this should be malleable and the players might go in directions that you're not anticipating. And I do think like more and more, a lot of adventure modules being published are a little bit more open-ended and have a lot of like modular elements to them. Like Tomb of Annihilation and Dungeon of the Mad Mage are very much like, here's a bunch of stuff that could happen. And like, it's not in any sort of order. It's just sort of as you sort of go. So I do like that aspect, but I'd say that if I was going to run a campaign out of a book, I would just still focus on one session at a time and also still focus on what do the players want, because those motivations can get very easily lost in a pre-written module.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as Jeff. I have never run a pre-published module. I have run Oath of the Frozen King, which is somewhat similar. It's an adventure kit, so it is a lot more open than a traditional module. But I've always enjoyed making my own, so that's always the route that I've gone. But I can't imagine that the prep would be vastly. It's just kind of the extent and the organization of your base material. It's kind of, you're either combing through your own notes or you're combing through a book that somebody published that has their better organized and better phrased notes with art.
Yeah, I think Matt brings up a super great point, that I think the best run campaigns will play out similarly either way, whether the material comes from your own brain, like the character motivations, players involving, things like that. Making sure that stays the focus either way, I think goes a long way. I really like that. Yeah, outside of that, unfortunately, the specifics of prepping a module, not too much there. We have an interesting question from Taylor Jeffrey, which is, what can you do to make sure that kind of the campaign world has life outside of the characters, so that it feels kind of like a place rather than like just as a thing, that kind of, rather than just as a framework for a game that they're playing, like an actual place that they're living in and involving themselves in. For me, so this is just kind of the way that my brain works, is very much in terms of like character motivation. So the NPCs that they're interacting with and the places that they're going, like, think about like, what do these people want Like instead of just thinking about like how they're going to interact with the players, like if the players never show up, what is that person going to want to do with themselves? Like how are they going to want to progress their own motivations, their own ambitions, their own lives? What does that town want to accomplish? And just kind of thinking about these people as people. And like how the players can, I think so many NPCs, I think like the players will ask them to help and they'll just do it, rather than having any sort of like, but you know it would really also help me if you did this for me. Like, so just thinking about like what they want and how they're going to try to get what they want out of the PCs just as much as the PCs are going to try to get what they want out of these people. And like what they do and what they want in the meantime, I think is the way that I would at least characterize it most, just because that motivation is kind of the thing that sticks in my brain the most. What about you guys?
Yeah, like one of the best pieces of advice I got about writing was like, if you're writing a scene, every single thing that a character says or does should be in some way geared towards what they want. And that's how you sort of drive the conflict. So absolutely, like think about what NPCs want too and have them actively working towards those things, even if they're not in, the field of view of the players. If there's battle happening, show the battle happening on the horizon, show smoke pluming in the distance, and the players sort of clue into, oh, this thing's happening. Like have them run into NPCs who are also trying to do other things that may or may not be related to what they're working on. So one of the best and weirdest piece of advice I've ever gotten on this was from Barker, where he said, like, keep a calendar and write down like what the villain of the campaign is doing on every day that the players are playing. And like, okay, the villain wasn't in this session. What was he doing? That sort of thing. Like, I don't necessarily say like get a calendar and do that, but just like think about it. Like think about where would this NPC be? What would they be doing? Would they have achieved their goal? Are they making progress towards it? How does it affect what the players are doing? What ramifications does it have? That sort of thing. Like if you just are mindful of that sort of stuff, you don't necessarily need to put a ton of effort towards really thinking about it.
Yeah, this is something that I actually find is one of my weaknesses, I think. This is not something that I do enough of. I tend to run very character-centric, heroic games. That's kind of just the way that I've always played, and that's kind of the games that I like to run. So I really enjoy kind of finding ways to make it seem like fate and destiny is kind of driving these characters into these places and meeting these people. I like the feeling of there being kind of this serendipity that seems to be involved. That being said, it's easy to have things that have happened before the players got there, or that happen afterwards that they receive news about. And to me, those are really easy ways of showing them that the world is larger than what they're doing. It may be something that is still directly tied to them, but they may not have a chance to be involved in what's going on.
Yeah, I think another little thing I don't want to say this incorrectly, but I'm pretty sure it might have been Tim, or at least he was talking to somebody where this came up. But like, if your players like approach somebody like in a town, have that person like be doing something else when the players walk in. Like if you walk into a shop, have the shopkeeper selling his wares to another customer, and like the players have to like interrupt them in order to like speak with them, because like he's a person with a life and a job. He's not just, I think so many times, and I do this all the time, like, so it's definitely something that I can get better at, of like the NPCs existing to serve the PCs in the scene, where it's like, I've just been waiting here all day, hoping that the adventurers are going to come by so they can ask me their questions. And it's like, that's not obviously how it works. So, like, if you go down to the docks to find the captain's yelling at the crew to lift up this stuff and get the cargo loaded. And he's got a very important schedule that he's got to keep in order to get his shipment down in time. And like, you're interrupting him to like get information from him. So, like, that's way more interesting than, you walk down and he's just there and you can just go up and talk to him. Like, so consider like what these people are doing, like not just before and after the scene, but during the scene. Like even as simple as like you're talking to a king and the king goes, "Hold on a second. Hey, servant, go tell this guy, make sure that the guards switch whatever." Like just little throwaway lines like that can like do a lot to like give life to these people, that they're doing things outside of just the game. That they have jobs and responsibilities and things like that that they have to keep up with.
Yeah, rather than just like rendering as the PCs get within like 30 feet of them, they just like pop into the world. I exist now. Hey, what can I do for you?
Yeah, I've always had this trouble with dungeoning because of that. It's like, okay, you guys are having this knockdown, drag out fight in room number 2, but in room number 3, there's reinforcements, but they're technically a separate encounter. So then you open the door after you finish room 2, and oh, there's more bad guys who didn't hear anything about what was going on and didn't rush to the aid of their compatriots. So one of the solutions that very young and immature Jeremy decided to do was, as far as having the players interrupt something that was going on, I had the party walk in on an orc chieftain who was in the middle of activities with his lover, and then proceeded to leap off of the bed completely and totally naked with his weapon and fight them that way. So I don't necessarily recommend that, but that kind of, hey, I was busy doing something else that didn't involve you, and now all of a sudden you're thrust into, well, God, it was a horrible choice of words, into the middle of it. So then you have to deal with that. Yeah.
Deal with the thrusting, right? Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. Oh boy.
Alrighty. So we just got one more, and this one's more of just like a personal taste question, which is kind of nice. From Caius, which he says, "Do you prefer campaigns that detail like epic, huge struggles where the world as a whole is like very different from the beginning, or do you prefer kind of smaller scope things where your setting isn't going to be drastically different at the beginning versus the end? It's going to kind of you're not going to have to rewrite so much or like imagine so much." So for me, if I had to pick, I'd much prefer like smaller personal struggles over like grand, huge events. That's just kind of my own thing. Like I'd much rather see like 3 people who live in this village just trying to like make it in that place rather than like we're leading the armies of good versus the hordes of darkness and the world's going to explode if we don't stop the giant evil. Like there's nothing wrong with that stuff, but if I had to pick my own thing, I'd much rather see a smaller, very personal, more intimate character driven story than like a big plot game where the characters are more or less inconsequential. They're just kind of vessels to experience the story and the setting rather than like their own people. Like I'd rather see that smaller scope detail than the bigger stuff. But that's just me.
I really like. I agree with you, Jeff, but I will add that I really like those small, personal, intimate stories told against a backdrop of something much bigger happening. Like the movie Blade Runner 2049, like tells like this very just beautiful, personal, just this tiny story, and there's all this stuff happening that affects that story, but ultimately what you're there watching is just the story of one person. And I really like that, and I like being able to tell those really close personal stories where there's a war happening or there's great magical turmoil occurring or something like that. Like that's kind of my jam, I feel like.
It's funny because I was actually going to say that, but just in the reverse. I actually like having basically kind of like one world-spanning event, like Ashes of Heaven, the campaign I ran online. There's this massive war that is kind of looming on the horizon, and all of the fallout is happening from it. But through the story of that, I like to tell how the personal backgrounds have pulled all of these specific individuals into that story. So along the way of them kind of figuring out and getting involved in this big overarching thing, we're discovering all of these smaller stories as we're progressing.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, and I guess like it's one of those things that's just like whenever somebody else says their thing, I'm like, actually their thing is the coolest, and then somebody else will say something different, and it'll be like, oh, actually, nope, what they said is super cool. So it's just kind of when you have a good group, a good GM and a good set of players, like it's difficult to go wrong, and they can all have some really amazing stuff. And I think kind of the ultimate thing is like sum of all is best. You want some stakes, but you also want people, and to see kind of their individual struggles within that. There actually is one more question, which I think is kind of a silly one to end on, but we'll do it anyways. That came from Lloyd, which is um, so I'm sure if you guys are anything like me, you have like 13 ideas for campaigns you could run, and then you'll be running one and get an amazing idea for another one 4 sessions into your other campaign, and you'll really want to run that one instead. But also, like what if anything do you guys do to kind of manage the new shiny campaign idea from the thing that you've already committed running to, and like how do you decide what is going to be a cool idea for later, if ever, and what actually comes to light that you actually do?
So this is advice that I live by outside of RPGs too. Like if I'm considering like buying something or committing to something, I give it like 48 hours and I sit with it. Like because I get middle of the workday, like, oh my God, it would be amazing to run this campaign. And like, I'm so tempted to like interest post and like commit to, a monthly game for a year. And it's that urge is so strong. And I've trained myself to be like, now chill, because it might not seem so fun in 2 days. And so I give myself 48 hours. And if after that time, it still seems like the coolest idea and I really feel the urge to run it, then I start giving it some serious thought. But until that point, it's like I have these just whims all the time and I can't follow every single one of them or I would never finish anything.
That's very, very true. That's similar to what I was talking about the rocks in the tumbler. I like to have it sit in my brain for a while, at least, so that I can kind of vet out whether or not it's a good idea, or whether it's a better like thing to drop into an existing campaign, as opposed to just doing something completely brand new. But like Momentum, as an example, was like 3 different world ideas at one point, that I had kind of just ruminating in probably for over 3 or probably 4 years, of just kind of me saving pictures into folders that I didn't really know what was going to happen. And then someday, just out of the blue, something happened in these 3 different elements. I saw a way to kind of fuse them into one idea, one setting, and then the floodgates were broken, and I couldn't not put some attention towards it at that point. The ideas were just coming so quickly that I was afraid I was going to start forgetting things if I didn't start writing things down. It was still a long time before I actually decided to run a game in the setting, but that I could at least put some attention towards that so that it wasn't distracting me from the other things I had already committed to.
Yeah, I'll self confess that this is something that I'm absolutely terrible with, and not just in RPGs. Like I'm very much just like caught up in the whims of crazy like things that'll catch my attention, um, and then like follow them for a day, and then be like, oh, I don't actually want this. It was just like it sounded cool, but now that I'm actually thinking about it, like it's not cool as I thought it would be. Now they know that it costs like work to do and like effort that requires it to be interesting. Um, but I think what you guys said is definitely valuable. Of like sit with it a little bit. Make sure that if it's something that's going to be really amazing, it'll probably still be exciting in a week. Uh, where if you just immediately throw up everything right off the top, then you kind of do risk the point of like you get 4 players who are super excited about your like Roman legionary game, and then you get sick of Rome 3 days later and you don't actually want to run it anymore. Like that's just you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you've like committed and like have people who are excited and relying on your ideas. So but I'm conflicted because I do think there's a degree of like striking while the iron is hot can be very valuable. Where like if you put off an idea that does genuinely excite you, then you risk like never doing something that could have been really cool that you were excited about and you really wanted to do, but then you're like, oh, let's wait, let's see if it's exciting, and then life happens and then it just never ends up coming out. So it's a conflict where it's like to one degree you kind of want to follow through. And I think kind of what Jeremy said is probably a good middle ground that I'll probably try to start doing, of kind of start building things out in your mind of like what this place would look like. Build the 5 pillars of the setting, put up a concept for how the campaign might start and like what the theme of it would be. And if it kind of continues your interest and you hit a point where there's going to be like a boiling over point where you just can't not do it, like it would just kill you not to do it. And at that point, you're probably ready to like officially commit. Um, so I don't think you want to like suppress those ideas, but there's a huge risk to like immediately just like having the interest post template like saved and stored on your second tab so you can throw up immediately anything that comes into mind. Because I definitely understand that temptation, and it's definitely led to like I think me letting people down in a bad way, where it's like I'll put up an interest post and a bunch of people will be like, "Yes, I want to do this," and then I just won't do it because I won't care about it anymore. And I think like reputation in the online space is an important thing, and you don't want to develop a reputation for like gathering people with no follow through. So just finding the right balance, I think, is important. And I'm saying that just as much to me as I am to Lloyd or anybody else.
Yeah, it is. It's tough to find that balance, especially creative people also tend to be flighty. And I say that pointing at myself because I tend to be flighty. But it is hard to find that balance of like, striking while the iron is hot, like you said, Jeff, but also like giving it time to marinate a little bit and make sure that it's actually something and not just a whim. So yeah, it's tough, but the more you sit with something, and I think that Jeremy, that's really good advice of like, start on it, do something with it, but don't necessarily pull other people into it just yet.
Yeah. And a nice, easy, quick tip is like, if you get an idea for a campaign that you just can't get out of your head, run a one-shot like pilot of it and then see how that goes. And if you run that and you're like, that was fun, but I got it out of my system, then you're all set. You had your idea, you executed it, you got to know what it was going to be like. And then if that's all that you need, then that's all that you need. And, problem solved on its own. But if it really catches you, you're like, oh man, that was exactly what I was hoping it was going to be. I really gotta, then you can kind of start to ramp up and see like, oh, well, maybe if we make this a thing that's more than just that. So little test sessions. So, maybe put up the interest post, but just for like a one shot that Saturday and then call it good after that. Unless you just, again, cannot get it out of your head, then you can leave it alone.
Yeah, for me, like it's very much a question of quality or quantity. Like if it's of ideas, if it's a one single burning desire to experience or run, usually I'll run a one shot, and I end up with all these really wacky, bizarre one shots that I run. Is because it's like, oh, holy shit, I really want to run a Masters of the Universe game, so I'll do that. But I'll contain it as a one shot, get it out of my system, because I understand that that's not probably going to make an interesting campaign. But if I have a quantity of ideas as opposed to a quality, then I'm like, okay, I need to sit on this for a while, because this sounds like it's going to be more than just a really great, fun flash in the pan. And I want to make sure that it's going to actually be fun and exciting before I really start committing to it.
I think that's kind of a great way to kind of mediate so that you still get to like do your cool things, that you're not like constantly like shutting yourself down and pumping the brakes, but also you're not flying off the tracks either. Um, I think is kind of the sweet spot that you want to be in. Yeah, that's all the questions that we had covered in the doc that we had gathered from people. So I think just kind of if anybody has any final thoughts, also if Matt, especially as the guest, if you want to let people know where they can find your own stuff, because you guys have been doing some cool stuff lately. So I'm sure there's plenty to go on. So where can people see more from you and kind of wrap things up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a YouTube channel called A Fistful of Dice where I mostly run live RPGs. And we actually have next session of the Provoker's Bleak Wrath is going to be a week from today. We finally got that scheduled. Life has just been really crazy with the birth of my daughter and everything. So I'm really looking forward to getting back to that campaign. I love playing with those guys. And I just released a new book with Absolute Tabletop. It's called Shadows Over Drift Chapel, and it's our second adventure kit. And people really seem to be digging it. I was really happy with it, and we're actually sending off for the print proof probably this week or next. I'm really excited to hold it in my hands. That's always the moment it becomes real for me. So, and you can check that out over on absolutetabletop.com. So, yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. This was a blast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on. The guest thing is somewhat new for the Dudes of Yore, but I like it. It's been a lot of fun to do that with the series that I've been running on the channel, and having a third voice, especially Jeff, having you along for the conversation is always fantastic. That's why we started doing this shit in the first place, and I've absolutely enjoyed it. I can't wait until Chad can hop back on board. I miss him. But Matt is certainly not a slouch as far as a substitution.
I'm no Chad Nick, but I'm doing my best here.
Truth. We could all be Chad Nicks. That would be.
Because very few people are Chad Nick. Yeah, the kind of guest live thing has kind of come like out of necessity, but I think it's kind of accidentally stumbled into something that's been really fun. So thank you very much, Matt, for coming on. It's been awesome to have you here, especially for something that you're kind of super good at. For the people who are somehow watching this who don't know Matt's stuff, I put all his links in the description, his channel, Absolute Tabletop website, all that stuff. So please check out his stuff and support them because their products are pretty dang amazing. And pretty much everything they do is worth it. But yeah, this has been super fun. So we have a little tradition on the Dudes of Yore, Matt, where at the end of all of our episodes, instead of having a singular sign off that we always say, we just make one up on the spot. They're usually really stupid, so no pressure, but the guest is the one who will deliver it. So here's a snazzy sign-off closing remark from Matt, who's going to tie off the episode.
Thank you for listening to the Dudes of Yore, where the king always drinks free.